Hello, and welcome to Session 3 in our ASUG Presents series on supply chain. I'm David Wascom, still part of the leadership team here at ASUG, and it is my pleasure to be moderating this series. Now, in case you missed the first two sessions, in Session 1, Martin Rowan and I had a great conversation about the state of the supply chain. It was an opportunity for us to explore what Martin and his team are seeing around how customers are managing through the challenges and opportunities we are all facing given today's interesting times. We talked about customers looking at their SAP investment as an asset and really working to sweat that asset to deliver the most value in managing and optimizing their supply chain performance. In Session 2, Christy Bain came on board and provided us all with some valuable insights on manufacturing and operational excellence by looking at things like planning strategies, capacity planning, and scheduling, and how real-time information adds flexibility and agility to shop floor planning and execution. Now, if you did not have a chance to catch these conversations when they first aired, no problem. They are available to you on demand for ASUG members on asug.com. So today's session, we'll be joined by Sean Alif, the senior partner at Reveal. Sean will be taking us on a deeper dive around inventory optimization, specifically how you can use your SAP asset to drive increased inventory turns and optimal mix and volume in your inventory. Like our earlier sessions, Sean's presentation is pre-recorded, but Sean will be with us live today in the chat to take questions and continue the conversation. Take advantage of this opportunity. Ask those questions. Get clarity to your challenges. Have your voice heard as we learn how to get the most from our SAP technology investment. And with that, Sean, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for that introduction. Really excited to be here with you in a follow-on now behind Christy and then Dave and Martin's introduction around talking about SAP as this asset and how it's helping us in these post-COVID times, helping us drive in times of uncertainty. And quite frankly, I just want to call out the fact that as an asset, this is really a tool set that we have at our disposal that gives us phenomenal opportunities to do many, many great things in running the business. And for this particular presentation, our focus here, following on the production planning, is now going to be talking to driving inventory optimization, and with that, increased turns that goes with it. So the objectives that we have got and set ourselves for today, the first is really, let's try and understand something of the standard capabilities that exist inside of SAP. And those standard capabilities, how do they help us in an operationalization sense to determine where we are with our inventory, what our stock turn ratio looks like, and understand where we have control to make a difference and to make adjustments and changes to the way we do business. We're also going to be looking at identifying where there might be potential for excess inventory. What does that look like? And the focus is really going to be around trying to show visibly what this actually looks like inside of SAP, so we can see visibly what the situation looks like, and as a result of that visualization, hopefully we can take better decisions and take us to a better place. And we're going to get to the end and wrap it up by looking at, well, optimization very often is impacted by materials that are common across multiple landscapes. And so what does that look like, and what is it that we need to be doing to focus our attention? So the agenda we have for today is as follows. The first, we're going to talk a little bit about the what, the why, the how of inventory optimization. Then we're going to talk about some of the key steps to inventory optimization and the process, what that looks like. We'll take some time to talk through how do we get to an optimal state using the visibility that's in the system itself. And we'll go through a number of examples that shows how you can interpret where we are today and how that is going to help us in making improved decisions and getting us to a point in the organization where we are more profitable, where we are more efficient, and we are meeting the requirements of getting to the customer with what they need at any one time. Then we'll shift up a gear a bit to the optimization challenges that there are for those materials that are used across multiple plants. And ultimately then we will wrap up the session, I think, with some closing remarks that will take us to where we need to be. So let's talk about two key definitions which I want to use to set the scene for where we are in this presentation. The first one is inventory management. Now, we heard earlier about the end-to-end supply chain, and that's really what we're trying to make sure, that we have an agile end-to-end supply chain which is well managed all the way from our customers to suppliers and from suppliers to customers and everything in between. So it's an integrated approach to the end-to-end supply chain. And it, in and of itself, requires that we have business processes that are appropriately managed so that we are sourcing the right materials, we're ordering on time, we're managing the arrivals, the receipts, etc. We're putting it away and storing it, and we are moving goods to the shop floor when it's needed and utilizing our inventory as is required. Inventory optimization, on the other hand, is really this art of trying to make sure that we are driving up service levels and at the same time driving down cost. So we want to increase service levels and reduce the cost that goes with it. And at the same time, make sure that we have product availability that's done in a way that we are minimizing the risk of carrying too much inventory, having excess, or stocking out. And laid over all of this at the same time are the various variables that we need to manage in that supply chain, from getting the demand in the system to managing different supply variables and then adjusting the rule set that's essential to make sure we have the right parameters in place. And you'll recall earlier on we did look at a continuum. It was called the business maturity continuum. And in the center of that are the business rules. And it's these business rules, which we'll come back to later, which need to be managed. So the fundamental premise that we're talking about, if we look at the diagram that we've got in front of us now, is that increasing service levels whilst managing our costs down, doing it in a way that we are managing process performance and having the right amount of inventory in play for us to be able to achieve that at the end of the day. And within that, I just want to raise one very important metric. Now, there are many metrics that we'll measure across the supply chain in terms of inventory and inventory optimization, but I want to talk specifically just to turns ratio for a moment. Now, a general definition that our finance team would come to would be the cost of goods sold over the beginning and end inventories. When it comes to executing in the world of a buyer, of a planner, of an MRP controller, we have to look at where do they have the opportunity to control something. And they can control either consumption or they can control the average inventory. And it's more likely in terms of the average inventory holdings where they're able to control what is out there. So the turns ratio we want to be using here is around consumptions divided then by our average inventory. And that's the definition that I would like to leave out there for us. So let's just talk a little bit about the why. What's the why behind the effective inventory optimization? We talk about an agile supply chain. We talk about the necessity of being fully optimized. And the holy grail of all of this is having the right products at the right place, the right time, and in the right quantities. Because that's going to enable us to get the inventory levels that are needed to meet the customer demand, and at the same time, ensure that our service levels are where they need to be and the cost is managed in context of that. Now, if we map this around to the notion of SAP as the asset and the functionality that we have as the asset, well, then we need to understand what are some of these capabilities that we have available to us that are used in order to help optimize, to increase our turns, and to get us to that agile space. And with that, what we're trying to do is to balance how much inventory we're holding against the demand and supply requirements of the business so that we're at an effective place. Now, that's the right-hand side of this particular diagram. On the left-hand side, it's taking us to the next level, which says, how do we broaden that so that we are optimizing materials that are commonly used across a much wider landscape and multiple plants? And in doing so, let's get to the point where we are finding which are the greatest contributors to either high or low inventory, which are those that contribute to stockouts, which are those that help us improve our turns, and so on. So that's the why behind this whole notion of getting to an effective inventory optimization process. If we were to talk about the what I'd like to suggest is if we look at this diagram that we have on the right-hand side here, this is showing something of the visual capabilities that we can see inside of our single source of truth, which is SAP. This is the asset that we are using to get the business outcomes that we need. And by visually being able to see the performance of our inventory, we're able to make better decisions and start to make the necessary adjustments and tweaks and changes that are needed to actually maintain minimum cost of our average inventory, to get the best fill rates, to make sure that our frequency of replenishment is meeting the needs and that we're in a more predictive space than would otherwise be the case. Now, if we can get that right, then we have a number of gains that we get over the course of the operations. We get to optimally fund the investments we're putting into safety stock. And we're going to talk about safety stock specifically in this discussion as well. We're going to get to the point where we can decrease the number of write-offs or the surplus and obsolete stock. We're going to make sure that we have fewer stockouts, and we're going to basically be able to manage our cost structure both from an admin and a resourcing point of view, and the amount of time that is spent managing and looking after this inventory in terms of going forward. What that means is if we take a look, SAP has a number of standard reports. So that what you're seeing on the screen now are a myriad of standard reports and capabilities that SAP brings to the table to enable us, firstly, to manage the noise that we have in the system. So if we look at what this is telling us, this is a typical inventory performance. We note two things. We note that the process deviation, in other words, the highs and the lows of our inventory performance, what's the highest point, what's the lowest point, is quite substantial. There's a lot of deviation that we're seeing in terms of this particular figure. Below the model, we're seeing something known as dead stock. Now, dead stock doesn't necessarily mean the materials are not moving. It's simply a water level that we are not dipping into. That's what it is. And we can see from this particular diagram here, we can see where our average inventory is, we can see what the process deviation and how much the dead stock. Now, I spoke about safety stock a little while ago, and the important thing here is that safety stock lives within this dead stock portion. And in a perfect world, we'd expect the one to equal the other, the safety stock to equal the dead stock. But too often we have a water level that's way above that, and therein lies opportunity for us to get better in terms of what it is we're trying to do. And we do that first by trying to say, let's get the process deviation under control. Let's get stability into our system. Let's get control, and let's start getting all of those process deviations smaller than they are today. What we might find in that process is that over that time period, our dead stock may well increase. But we need to manage that as we go. But the first thing is to try and get our process deviation under control and get rid of the instability in the system. Then we can go after reducing our average inventory and getting average stock down to where we need it to be. And you'll notice that the possibility exists and the dead stock will go with it. And then, of course, with that, we want to make sure we reduce it, and finally want to make sure that we are not stocking out. And all the while, the approach that we're looking to do is to make sure that that visibly we can see exactly what is happening with the performance of these particular materials. And so the red graph that we see at the top is where we are today, very predictable it looks to me, and the yellow one is where we want to go in terms of the future. So one of the great benefits that we have is we have a myriad of standard tools available to us inside of SAP that will help us do analysis work, will help us visually see where we are in terms of performance, and will enable us, therefore, to make much better decisions in going forward in our supply chain optimization process. And here we can see an example of just exactly what those reports look like. There are many of them. We see graphics around inventory performance in the past. We see graphics around inventory performance in the future. We see some of the graphics relating to capacity planning, which you saw earlier on in the production planning presentation that we had as well. And these are all brought to bear and to be used when it comes to saying, well, let's look at some of the key stock analysis principles. Now, if you look at this particular slide right now, we have an inventory performance process here that's showing a high level of process deviation. So there's a very high point and a very low point, if you take a look at this, of how the process deviation is playing out at the end of the day. And at the bottom end of it, we see the level of dead stock. Now, dead stock here is defined as the water level, the lowest water level which we dip into. And I raised that specifically because we had spoken earlier on about safety stock, and safety stock lies within this water level. And in a perfect world, we'd expect the safety stock and the dead stock to be the same. But very often we have safety stock in there, but we have a much higher water level that is carrying stock over and above that which we actually need. So the first point of call then is to say, well, how do we then take the fluctuations in terms of this process deviation out of play? Let's start getting things to quieten down and create stability. What that might mean, however, is at the same time we might be faced with a situation where the dead stock increases, but that's fine. The initial step is to take out the fluctuations and create stability. Then we can go after the dead stock, the average stock, and try and push that down and get it to reduce. And we remember what we said earlier on, that consumption over average increases our turns. That's exactly how we're going to drive the increase of our turns ratio. We may well find at the same time that dead stock comes down with it, because our objective then is to say, once we've got our average stock to where it needs to be, let's now go after the excess that lies in that dead stock water level and reduce that and get that out of play as well. The final thing we want to make sure we're doing is that we're not stocking out, because when we're stocking out, we know what's happening there. We are going to be affecting our customer requirements and not be able to meet on the needs that we have from our customers. And so the use of this asset that we have in terms of its ability to visually show us where we're at, what some of the opportunities look like, really becomes a powerful mechanism for us. And we can see in this instance, if we were just to work through those stock analysis principles right there, what we tried to do is we tried to say, let's take that red graph that looks very predictable, but is running on the high side, and let's push it down and bring it more in line with where the yellow graph looks. So in terms of the how, that becomes a key piece of the puzzle for us. That then said, let's just think for a minute around some of the key steps then in the inventory optimization process. The first thing we need to do is to identify where it is we are going to take action. You know, many companies we go into, we've found some companies 170,000, 250,000 materials. So where do you start? We need a means to identify and prioritize where to start. Then we need to go and review the rules. Going back to the continuum, stage 3 of that was around the business rules. Go and review what those business rules are. They correct? Conduct the analysis then, and based on that analysis against what we've looked at, look at what changes or adjustments, adaptations need to be made, and finally then go on and measure and monitor the outcome. So that would be a typical, very high level approach to getting the optimization process under our belt, so that we can meet customer service demand, we can put out the right services of level of service levels, and that we can do it at the lowest cost. So that would be the 5 steps that we'd want to go through. Now, one of the ways to do that is to use those tools that we saw earlier on. In this case here are 3 transaction codes out of SAP. These are inside of the ECC model of SAP, and I want to just say that, guys, S4HANA is coming down the road. We know it was said early on, S4HANA is going to be fabulous. I think that was Martin's terminology that he used. These same transactions will be available, maybe in a different form, inside of your Fiori tiles and inside of S4HANA. So the principles of what we're trying to do here, in terms of, 1, identify Where are the areas of the highest average stock that I carry? Where's the areas of the highest dead stock? And where are what we call movers and shakers? Where are those materials which I could find in that MC.9 transaction in your logistics information system? Where are those where I have high averages, but I also have a high level of consumption? And by mapping these together, each of these columns represents a different plant. By mapping these together, we start to see what are the common materials where we can start. Now, we can start at 25, we can go to 30, we can go to 50, 100, whatever it might be. But the point is we have a means and a mechanism to get to a stage that we are more easily able to identify where we want to focus attention to start. And that becomes really important, that we're able to do that. What that will do for us is then get us to a situation where inside of this asset that we have, SAP, we will be able to see within the single source of truth, what are the materials we want to focus our attention on? What is their current state in terms of average inventory? And what's the deal in terms of consumption? So we can understand and see what that consumption level actually looks like and go after it in terms of trying to make adjustments or changes and fix things in the master data. So I would be able to take any one of these particular materials and then start to visibly look at, well, what does it look like? How is it performing today? And based on how it's performing, I'm able to see things like pushing down the averages. How do I improve my turns? Where am I holding extra costs? How do I reduce my storage space? And ultimately put in place a plan that's going to help me drive down my averages and get me into a stable process and a stable environment in terms of what I'm carrying to do my business at this point in time. And along with that comes a number of things relating to cause and effect. That also helps me when I start to look at, well, what is the cause of something and the effect? Bringing in too much inventory based on poor demand, well, my averages are going to go up. So I can get to see the cause and effect between the two of them. If I've got obsolescence that's way too high, or I'm building stock that I don't need and I've got the incorrect mix, well, I'm going to have high levels of dead stock and excess cover in certain areas along the way. So it starts to enable me to get to a point where I can look at cause and effect and make better decisions based on the priority areas that are going to give the biggest bang for the buck and at the end of the day make the biggest difference in terms of making decisions and so on. So I think a very important concept that we want to put out there. We spoke about master data. Now that was the second piece. We've analyzed and we've found where we want to focus attention, prioritize. Now we need to go and start looking at the master data. Now this is not everything relating to master data. This is really just talking about some of the key views, in this case the MRP 1 to 4 views, and saying I need to be able to go in there, make sure that the rules that I'm setting up as part of that quadrant 3 or that stage 3 of the continuum are correct. And so when MRP runs, I'm getting the kind of results that I need. And in order to do that, I may need to find that I have to make changes. And those changes, if I am making, I need to communicate them. Because I think part of the issue will be is that a change made by an MRP controller or by a buyer or by a planner, there is going to be a knock-on effect in an integrated system that someone else within that integrated supply chain is going to feel the pain or feel the effects or the impacts of those changes. So it's really important that I make those adjustments, make those changes, but I do it in the context of effective communication and bringing a cross-functional dynamic into play. So the master data piece is really important. And what we can see with that, this is typically what it would look like inside of SAP. There are MRP 1 to 4 views. In MRP 1, we're certainly looking at the MRP procedures, we're looking at the MRP types we're using, we're looking at the lot size data and how that's going to play into my decision in setting this material up to be the best that it can be. If I go into the MRP 2 view, I can look at the procurement data that's out there. Am I procuring it externally, making it internally? How am I scheduling it? What kind of safety stock am I putting in place? What are the lead times? MRP 3, I'm looking in terms of my forecast requirements and my planning. what's the availability check that I'm going to be using for ATP, and certainly what are some of those key configurations that need to be maintained for that. And then, of course, finally, under MRP4, getting to take a look across the bill of materials. What are some of the issues that need to be considered in terms of dependent requirements? Am I in forward consumption or backward consumption? Am I going to be looking at discontinued parts and the like? So it really is key to get to the point that we say, right, here is the master. These are the rules by which I'm going to make my business better. These are the rules that I'm going to follow. These are the rules I need to adjust to make things happen. Okay, so that brings us then to getting to an optimal state with visibility inside of the system. And let's begin by just talking about how important it is to get predictability, to get stability, and to get our process side of the house under control. Because you'll see what happens here is that many of these processes that are either broken or processes that need to be addressed make up the rocks that you see below the water here. So I've got overbuying, or I've got late shipments, or my data integrity isn't there. I've got old elements back to 2015 that are still in my system. I'm not driving integration to the end-to-end supply chain. And all of these rocks, the way we tend to get by it is we cover it with higher levels of inventory. So the water level simply goes up. And so what we're trying to achieve at the end of the day is to say, let's address those process systems, let's address those organizational inefficiencies, and as a result of that, give ourselves a fighting chance to put us into a good place to be able to reduce the inventory to the levels that they need to be at. That then will bring us full circle back to what we looked at earlier on around, well, what are we trying to achieve in this optimal state? Well, what we said was we want to increase our service levels, we want to drive down our operational costs, we want to make sure that process performance is stable, it's predictable, and that we've reduced the process deviations, and as a result of that, we are now getting to an optimized level of inventory that is properly segmented, it's optimized, and when reductions are needed, we're making that happen. So that gives us, I think, a pretty good introduction into getting to that optimal state. What we need to do with that is, what are some of the things then to consider when we are optimizing? Well, the first thing I think it is we spoke early on already, was around doing the analysis. And that analysis works alongside a segmentation approach. Let's segment our materials, and earlier on we spoke about those with high value and high consumption. There may be other ways that we need to segment materials and do some form of an ABC classification and an ABC analysis to say, I want to do it by vendors, or I want to do it by different plants, I want to do it by material types, whatever it might be. But we need to look at how do we segment it and then analyze it so that we can make the changes which we just looked at. And once we've made those changes, we can ultimately get to the point where we're going to measure the outcomes and measure our results as an outcome. Now, just looking at this slide, just two things by the way. If you look at the red graph on the left-hand side, that's my current inventory performance. That's what's happening today. That's how this particular material is responding. This is how it is performing. The green graph on the bottom right-hand side is post my adjustments and my changes, and it's looking forward. That's how I'm expecting it to behave in the future. So we get this ability to both look backwards and forwards and hopefully get us to a better place in terms of the decision making that we need to do. So with that said, let's just take a look at a couple of examples. We want to create stability and control. Here are two examples that we can take a look at where there is a consistent and constant rate of consumption. On the left-hand side, we're managing this by way of forecast, and that forecast is having to deal with changes against sales forecast and consumption adjustments that have been made accordingly. Sometimes we're over forecasting, sometimes we're under, or we're over consuming, or we're under consuming against forecast. On the right-hand side, we've gone down the road that Christy spoke about in the previous session on production planning. We have our production planning processes in place. We're applying the right strategies. We are now managing by capacity, and suddenly these two things are coming together, and we're getting ourselves into a far better position in terms of value to business, where we are reducing inventory, our service levels are being improved, and we're increasing the transactional automation possibilities that are out there. So a good example to visually demonstrate what it is that these standard tools can bring to us. We're going to find we run into places where we have too much. Our inventory is performing way too high. We're carrying far more than we need, and that has a knock-on effect into trying to understand, well, what's coming next? How much is going to come? Where am I warehousing this? Where does it lie? How long is it going to take me to count the stock that I have? So we really need to guard against getting ourselves into a position where we may have reacted to something along the way and got ourselves into a place where we have way too much inventory for what we actually need. The one on the right-hand side talks about slow moving, which, by the way, is different to the dead stock. Remember, dead stock we said is a water level. The slow moving is just not consuming. Nothing's happening. There's no consumption taking place at all. So from an inventory performance point of view, in both these counts, we're now carrying too much inventory. If we think about high buffer inventory, here are 3 good examples of how the inventory is currently performing and that it is at a level that it does not need to be at. This one shows that we have a very high average stock level. Along with that, of course, is the dead stock, which we see in the second one. Both of these graphs are showing us that the water level is way, way, way too high. It's a long way above where we need to be, and there is tremendous amount of opportunity for us as a business to go after it and to say, let's get this under control. Let's run the business in terms of the same performance, but drop it down. We can drop the top one probably 2/3 of the way down. The second we can probably drop at least 1/3 to 1/2 lower than it is now. And the net result of that will be a significant impact for the business. If we take a look on the final one on the right side there, we see again that there is so much value that's lying out there that's just not turning. It's not that the SKU itself is not being used or that the SKU itself is not active, but it is just not being used. And there's an interesting ratio, if you have a look at the one on the right-hand side there, between the dead stock and the average stock. And that ratio is highlighted in the red, then I think it says about 56%. Now 56% ratio of dead stock to average is, by all accounts, pretty high. It may be in a very slow moving environment, a maintenance type environment, that you could go to 50% or 45%, but 56 is really on a high level. So again, we start to see high buffer inventory and the inventory performance, and here lies the opportunities. And even if we just took those top 25 that we started off in the early part of this presentation, and we were to get those under control, the financial benefits, the performance benefits could actually be significant. This is just about talking about predictability versus unpredictability. And I think if I was to ask you that question, I think most would say, well, these two really are predictable. And the way we know that it's predictable is that you can see that the consumption patterns, that's the downward pieces of those graphs, are parallel to one another. And it says to us, therefore, that, look, consumption is predictable. And therefore it begs the question, if that's the case, why then do we supply in such an unpredictable way? And it is a question we need to take a look at, and we need to ask ourselves, is our process under control? Is it stable? And are we going to get the results that we need at the end of the day? So once again, the predictability versus unpredictability is another issue that we look at in terms of inventory performance. Here's somewhere someone has built a tower to heaven, it looks like. What's probably happened in this instance here with this huge increase is that someone stocked out and then reacted. And because we stocked out, we reacted in such a way that we've gone pretty much over the top right now. And so the net effect of these things is that either there's an error with demand, or there's a forecast problem, and we know forecast is never 100% correct. The question is, why then are we keeping on buying and making more than we need, than we can consume? So we really need to look at those consistent rates and not react and panic in moving on to making buys and purchases that are potentially not necessary for us to do. This one is around the customer impacts, and this impacts customers because we see a number of stockouts. And because there was a stockout, again, a panic reaction. We start to see the reorder point. We're way below the reorder point on a number of occasions, which would then start to suggest that we need to revisit that. Let's go back to the master data. Have we done it correctly? Have we selected the right material, in fact, for reorder point planning in the first place? And then, of course, our safety stock, and this one we're seeing we're continuously below safety stock. The safety stock should be giving us a warning and telling us, guys, we're going to run into trouble. We have maybe an unreliable supplier and so on, but we really do need to make sure at the end of the day that we've got the right rules in place to avoid the stockouts, the correct material selected for reorder point planning, and in this case here, that our safety stock is at the place that it needs to be. In this one, I just want to quickly talk through the fact that we have consumption over average is giving us a stock turns here of around about 9. The deviation here is very, very high. And what we're trying to do here is to reduce that process deviation. And as long as we can do that and reduce the process deviation, we're also going to find that we can start reducing our averages. And the moment we can drive those averages down and get them lower, then guess what? Our turns ratio will get better. Our turns ratio will go in the right direction, and we'll be achieving the business goals and the objectives that we're setting out to do so. What we see in terms of this visibility here is around a predictable demand but an unpredictable supply. Now we're seeing that on the basis of the parallel lines. Once again, we can see the white parallel lines of consumption. But if we look at the supply lines, those are the ones in yellow. So you can see where the materials are coming in. And these are our lot sizes, and there's two dynamics at play here. The one is an inconsistent lot sizing. So today's lot size is 1,000, tomorrow is 200, then it's up to 500, then it's 1,000, and it's down to 200. The lot sizes are very erratic, as are the frequencies. So in terms of bringing it in, we're bringing it in 2 weeks, in 1 week, in 2 weeks, in 1 week. So inconsistent frequencies, inconsistent lot size really does become a problem for us, and we need to make sure that we're managing those, because otherwise we're putting undue pressure onto the warehouse. We're increasing our transportation costs, the operational costs are going up, and that upward trend in terms of the inventory is taking us to a place where we're going to be carrying way too much inventory at the end of the day. So what we need to be checking on is managing our lot sizes, ensuring that the lead times are accurate and are correct so that we avoid early deliveries, and then we need to be looking at what are the options to drive down our averages at the end of the day. And I think the final example on this here really is just around driving down the averages. If we look at this particular graph, I think we saw a similar one early on, very, very predictable in terms of the consumption that's happening. What we want to do is to drop the averages down to a different level, as with the safety stock, so that the dead stock reduces. And if we look at the outcome, if this was to be our target and our goal and we were to achieve it, the good news is that there's a 59% reduction in the average inventory that would come as a result of this particular exercise. So we have the opportunity here to really drive hard and to make sure that we reduce averages, safety stock and dead stock, and get to a much better place in terms of the turns ratio going up and a 59% reduction in working capital, which makes it a whole lot easier for us. Stability and reducing the averages. One of the questions to watch out for is that we go too quickly, because stability on the left is great when we've reduced our lot sizes and the cycle times and it's working in our favor. We need to be a little bit careful if we look at the right-hand side to go too extreme, because what we find is in that extreme cases we can get the reductions we need, but then our lot sizes can be so small that they start to increase the costs of actually getting materials in, and the frequencies are far too frequent. It's happening too often. So transportation costs go up, and it, in fact, is not a good outcome for us at the end of the day. So while we want to reduce the average, let's also look to stabilize the process at the same time. The last one in this particular section is getting value by controlling the supply. So all that's happened here is about building confidence amongst our colleagues and amongst our planners, amongst our buyers, and how to drop that inventory over time slowly, based on predictable consumption, moving towards smaller lot sizes, controlling those cycles as we go, ultimately getting the lower inventories and getting the higher turns ratio that we need as a business at the end of the day. So we're going to get the value by looking to how do we control that supply and make sure that we can get things in an appropriate manner. In this particular instance, this company had a 40% saving in overall inventories, which is pretty significant. And if you look at the next couple of slides that are shown here together, these are just real life success stories, and they are showing where we started in the process and where we have ended. And if we look at some of the results, they are significant. Significant reductions in average inventory, significant reductions in dead stock, very good reductions in terms of the amount of safety stock that we need to have on board, and at the end of the day, still delivering to meet customer requirements and increasing our turns. So the visibility and the visualization that we get from using these standard tools that are available to us is very, very powerful indeed. So just on optimizing the materials across multi-paths, the same principles apply, but I think there is a nuance, and I just want to show and share a couple of slides that have visualizations of what happens when you look at the same material across multiple plants. And so if we look at this case here, here's a raw material. So a single raw material, and if we look at what's going on in terms of the bill of materials that it is part of and the finished goods that it is going into, we start to see that if we fall short in this one particular material, there's a significant knock-on effect across the board. And we see that by looking at the BOM on the right-hand side. We can see how many exceptions there are because this raw material was unavailable when it was needed, or we didn't meet the promise, or we didn't deliver on time. We start to have this knock-on effect, and it's a significant ripple effect across the business, which we need to be aware of and we need to be careful about. And so when it comes to multi-plants, here's an example of a situation where there are 67 plants for this particular material. And if we look graphically what it represents, these 67 plants, we can see the green graph is the number of material issues that are happening. The blue one is the number of receipts that we are getting in, and the red is the performance of our inventory. Now that looks fairly good actually if you look at it across 67 plants. This looks quite good because the gap between receipts and issues is narrowing and the inventory is starting to come down. However, if we start to say, well, let's take a look at the top 4 plants within that. Which are the top 4? And let me look at the highest average inventory against the highest number of issues against that plant, using the tools we introduced earlier on, which was the movers and shakers from the LIS in MC.9, the average inventory in the document evaluation reports of MC49, and the dead stock in MC50, we start to get a slightly different picture. So we went from something in the 67 plants to 4 plants, and that picture looks different. And if we take it another step further, and we start looking at it by those 4 plants themselves, we get completely different performance pictures that are happening. Which means very often we have to take a look wider than the single plant that we may be working in at a particular time, if that particular material exists across multiple plants. and see what are the synergies, what does the network actually look like, how can we best manage that as a network and make sure that the master data is appropriately set up across the multiple plants as opposed to being the same right across the board. So it does give us an opportunity to say we need to manage multiple plants in a different way than if we are simply going to go one plant by one plant at a time. So we really need to think more as a cross-functional team. That's what so cross-functional teams across those plants need to come together in terms of trying to manage how we pull this thing into play and get the ultimate value. If you recall the business maturity continuum, in the business maturity continuum we saw 5 stages, all leading to business value. And the business value was made up of the outcome of the right decisions from stabilization through data integrity, through the business rules, through optimization, and finally out to business value. And so this needs to be managed in the context of a cross-functional team where process-aligned people are coming together, understand what's happening in terms of the data that's moving up and down the system, that there is ownership and accountability that's clear in the organization, and that at the end of the day, the outcome is analyzed and we can see the results in terms of the KPIs that we have. And finally, of course, then we are meeting the ultimate goals and objectives that have been set for us as an organization and becoming more effective in terms of being able to deliver on the customer. So to wrap up, just a few things. The first is we need to maintain minimum cost of our average inventory. That's the way to improve our turns. Secondly, let's aim for the highest fill rates for the least amount of stock that we can carry in order to still meet that and get the kind of performance we need to our customers. We need to manage the frequency in which replenishment is made so that we're actually at an optimal cost level. We saw one example earlier on where it was happening too frequently, and as a result of that happening too frequently, our costs in fact were going up and increasing. Our goal is to get to achieve predictable control in terms of inventory performance. At the same time, to optimize the funds that we're investing in safety stock. How much is lying in safety stock? Is it essential? Is it necessary? Is it the right decision? We want to decrease the write-offs and the surplus, so where we have obsolete stock, let's decrease that and not allow that to get away from us. We saw in terms of some of the dead stock that we probably had multiple opportunities to do this and to look after it. We certainly need to go after fewer stockouts because that's about improving the availability and the productivity of what it is we're trying to achieve. And then, of course, we want to reduce both the admin costs and the costs of the resources that are spending time managing inventory and the like. So this is really about a journey. We're on a journey to excellence. That journey requires collaboration, and it requires an integrated approach of multiple role players across this end-to-end supply chain. And everyone working inside of a single source of the truth so that the asset which we have purchased and that we are using as our single source of truth, namely the SAP ERP system, is doing what it needs to be and is being used to its fullest. So I think with that, folks, we've come now to question time. I want to thank you for having been part of this conversation with me, and we're going to open it up to questions. So please feel free to ask any questions you need to. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and again, thank you. I'm David Wascom. I'm the Senior Vice President of Executive Programs and Head of Content here at ASUG, and glad to have you here today. Glad to have you participating in our session today. We've got some time here for questions. There are a few questions that have come in through the Q&A. Also, if you want to contribute something to the chat, please do. Sean, thanks. Great stuff, right? And I can tell you as a former supply chain guy, and working in wholesale distribution, right, I saw a lot of screens that brought back a lot of memories from your presentation today. And most of them were good. Not necessarily all of them. They were generally good. So a couple good questions from the audience. I'm going to start with one that literally just came in from Beverly. So kind of, are there good ASUG training or SAP trainings to help with this? I can start from an ASUG standpoint. We do cover the general topic of supply chain pretty regularly through our content portfolio. And so Beverly, I'd say take a look, look at what we have coming up from events. Take a look at our communities as well, because we've got a couple of communities that are focused on supply chain, inventory management, procurement. And so my guess is there's going to be some areas out there where you can connect and start to get information. Formal SAP training, there's absolutely. I can tell you back in the day, I took a lot of the procurement training back when I was on the customer side of things. And then you can reach out to partners, companies like Reveal, where they can provide more targeted or more specific capabilities there as well. So there's a wide range of options available to you there, both from ASUG as a member, SAP as an SAP customer, and obviously talking to the partner community.
Cool.
Another question just came in. Will we have access to the deck? Absolutely. We'll provide information post-event through a post-event survey about how to make that happen, but absolutely you'll have access to that. So a couple of questions for you, Sean. So you called out, right, so obviously one of the things that people tend to look at very heavily when you talk about metrics is to look at that turns ratio, right? Look at your turn rate. Can you go through just to make sure that, because what I found is not everybody defines it the same way. Is there kind of a way SAP defines it, or is there sort of a standard way to talk about what a turn is?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, David. I mean, I think essentially there are probably two calculations that we can draw from SAP that will help us measure the turnover rate. The first one is generally in a financial space, where we look at the cost of goods sold and divide that by the average inventory. And that gives us what that turn rate looks like. Now, once you get into the operational space, and we're talking about buyers and we're talking about planners, et cetera, and what they can control, we really are talking about what is consumed, what does the consumption look like, and that probably translates into sales against the average inventory. So the higher that ratio is, then obviously the faster we are turning it or selling the inventory, and the less potential then we have therefore for carrying excess inventory. So generally, when we're teaching this, we talk about the high inventory turnover means that our sales volumes are probably going up. We're certainly consuming more. We're probably reducing our operating expenses. We're increasing our asset turnover. And as long as we're not stocking out, which is the other part of the challenge, then we're efficiently starting to balance stock between demand and supply for the products which we're providing. So I think in short, it's really around consumption divided by average inventory gives us what that turn ratio looks like.
Fantastic. Hey, great comment just came in the chat for you, Sean. I'm going to ask, maybe you can share your email address to Steve, and y'all can connect to maybe even provide some additional content around the slides we just went through. He's looking to leverage this content for something he's working on as well. So. So I've got a question. I'm going to actually kind of play sort of moderator's privilege. I've got a question from my time back when I was on the other side of this. One of the challenges that we had that I'm sure a lot of the folks on the call today have similar types of challenges is we faced, in fact, pretty much all of our demand was unplanned demand, right? I didn't know. We weren't manufacturing, so I didn't know kind of what my output plan was going to be. It was just a function of what ultimately we were able to sell to customers or what they came in to buy from us. And so we ended up kind of as a symptom of that, or as an impact of that, was we would carry maybe unnecessarily high levels of inventory in order to, we were looking at kind of service levels where we didn't want to have stock outs when customers came in and needed something, because if we didn't have it, they were just as likely to go to the next guy down the street and buy it from him. And if he had it, then the next time they're going to start there, right? So we always kind of elevated a lot of our inventory levels. And where that really impacted us is as we figured out kind of the total cost of inventory ownership. And for us, a big part of that was actually the acquisition cost of inventory. There was obviously the cost of the material, but there was the shipping and transportation costs to get it to our warehouses. So we had built a fairly comprehensive system that allows us to take that total cost, right? So we were figuring out, and we can spend some time on that later if we want, but we had a couple of product classes where it was it created some interesting, and you know, we talked about the graphs, but we had some very interesting graphs as a result of it, because the material was very heavy. It was copper wire or metallic pipe conduit for electricians, and we would typically try to buy that by a freight allowance from the manufacturer. So we didn't have to pay the freight directly, right? The manufacturer would pick up the shipping costs and they'd pay for the truck to haul it to our store. And so you would see these huge spikes in what appeared to be, you know, like we got some sort of crazy reorder points, or we had some other thing, but essentially it was, I want to buy this stuff by the truckload when I buy it. So, you know, I may sell conduit in 10-foot pieces, but I buy it, you know, 40 or 60,000 feet at a time, because that ends up being a full truckload of conduit. And it created some very challenging issues for us in terms of being able to manage turns around those products and being able to manage the inventory value around those. I'm not even sure there's a question here, but I just want to kind of get your perspective on that. Have you dealt with stuff like that in the past where customers had to deal with, you know, basically really big purchase volume or purchase dollars, and then they get sold out in a very different way?
Yeah, I think generally what we find is that, you know, it comes as a result of the conditions we start putting around us. And we come up with these conditions that says, well, we need to buy the truckload, or we need to buy so that the silo is filled up to the top. And I think what we really need to do is to start to challenge those. And generally, I think the measuring stick for me has always been, whose KPIs are we actually looking at in making the decision to go in that particular road? Now, sometimes it's a KPI that the procurement team has that is far more convenient, and I get a discount or whatever if I buy these volumes. Or it's a production KPI that says, well, I need to keep my machines going, and I therefore need to have this stuff available for me. And I think if we can get alignment in terms of what the KPIs are, who is measuring what, and why from a business perspective it's important to do that, I think we start to break down some of the nuances which are sometimes true, sometimes not so true. And we therefore are able to sometimes break through it and get agreement. And you'll see one of the slides I think we spoke about, there was this whole notion of a process-aligned team, this cross-functional team. And so the question is, how do we bring together all of these different role players who have an interest in what's out there? And that would be procurement, or it would be production, or it would be the logistics team, or it would be finance. And everyone has these different interests that go to make up a result at the end of the day. If we can bring those together, I think we start finding that we get the right KPIs, we start getting the right safety stock measures that we might want to have in, we start talking about the right volumes, whether we need a full truck or not. And if we do need a full truck, are there other ways of doing it than simply, say, filling up with the pipe that you were talking about as we go? But so getting that collective buy-in, I think, is important.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. Yeah, because again, that was just one of those areas that we always struggled with. So. So looking at the clock, I think we've probably got time for really one more question before we shut things down for the day. Okay. So, you know, I love the idea of moving to this concept of inventory optimization versus almost like a reactive or, you know, kind of fire drill that we typically see around inventory. If you had to pick kind of maybe the top 2 or 3 considerations for companies that are trying to make this transformation to the inventory optimization mindset, what would they be?
So I think the considerations, if you were looking to shift into an optimization strategy, the first is we need to assess what our current inventory is about. And that's more than simply counting, you know, what's on hand. It's around reviewing things like strategic stock for components and material, identifying substitutes. Can we get them locally, regionally, or as a part of our global footprint? So a good thorough assessment, I think, of inventory and what's required. The second, I think, is considerations on some of the geographic realities that we have. Because there are certainly, we know, capacity constraints in obtaining either the components, raw materials, or the associated logistics and production requirements of where is the inventory coming from. And I think in today, it matters far more than it maybe did years ago. And that, I think, requires maybe reconsidering things about nearshoring or reshoring things for critical components, and to make sure that we have a reliable supply that's not going to result in a disruption. I think the third one is really around maybe key production lines, Because if we think about what we've been through in the pandemic and so on, and we've had some real serious disruptions, we've had force majeure, etc., that we've been faced with, it may be necessary from time to time for us to scale back on production to protect our most profitable production lines. And we've seen that with some of even the big brand names today. We've seen the need to scale back to what are the core lines that we're looking on. So some form of segmentation to identify and prioritize those products and the stocking levels. I think that would be an important thing to look at, because you're going to be faced with trade-offs that need to be made. And I suppose the last issue really is around that word visibility. And I used it a few times, I think, in this conversation, because it's worth noting that very often we get back into the old spreadsheet-driven planning systems. And when we get into these disruptions, guess what? We get hit hardest where there's manual activity, where there is time lags in data collection, where there's poor human-based analysis that may be happening, or any other task-driven system. So visibility then really does come into play and under context. So building a strategically optimized inventory does require organizations to have that end-to-end visibility. And we argue, let's do it in one source of the truth, which is SAP, instead of outside of the system.
Absolutely. Hey, Sean, fantastic session today. Getting some great comments in the chat. Really appreciate it. And again, we'll be following up with the information today to everybody that attended. You know, we're halfway through this series, and we're looking forward to continuing the series with the guys from Reveal and with you, our members. So please continue to reach out to us around content, reach out to us for our events. Looking forward to participating with you both in virtual events and in-person events going forward. We're at time. Again, appreciate your time today. Thank you for sitting with us, and look forward to seeing you at the next event. Sean, attendees, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.